The man named Paul Conroy regains consciousness inside a dark and cramped space, with his hands and mouth bound. There's a lighter nearby, and when he lights it, he shockingly discovers that he is trapped inside a coffin. After an intense struggle, Paul manages to remove the cloth covering his mouth and begins to shout for help, but soon realizes that no one can hear him. He then tries to open the coffin to escape, but the task becomes increasingly difficult as his hands are still tied. Hey, before we continue with the summary, I invite you to subscribe to the channel to receive the best summaries. Now, continuing. Paul then notices the presence of a nail and somehow uses it to free his hands. He breathes a sigh of relief and gathers all his strength to try opening the coffin once more, but without success. He starts to lose all hope and screams loudly. Suddenly, Paul hears a vibrating sound. Upon investigating, he discovers a phone, which brings him some relief. He uses the phone to call emergency services, and fortunately, the call goes through. When an operator answers, Paul identifies himself as an American citizen working as a truck driver in Iraq. He gets straight to the point, revealing that he is buried in a coffin and has no idea of his current location. However, to his dismay, the operator mentions that he is in Ohio and can't do much to help him. Paul tries calling his wife several times, but she doesn't answer, probably because she's out somewhere. So he leaves a message informing her that he is trapped in Iraq and asks her to notify the National Guard. Next, Paul calls the FBI in Chicago. An agent answers the call, and Paul immediately begins to explain his distressing situation. He reveals that he was working as a truck driver in Iraq, and that one day, while on his way to deliver kitchen supplies to a community center, children began throwing stones at him. Then some people appeared from behind and started shooting, resulting in the deaths of several of his colleagues. The last thing Paul remembers is being hit on the head with a stone and passing out. When he regained consciousness, he was inside the coffin. As Paul continues to explain, the call is suddenly interrupted and the signal is lost. Paul desperately tries to regain the signal, and when he finally does, he calls the same number. However, this time the call is connected to another agent. She asks for the security code from the previous conversation, but unfortunately, Paul didn't note it down. Thus, the call goes to voicemail and is eventually disconnected. Finally, Paul begins to realize that he might not get out of this situation alive. However, suddenly he recalls receiving a missed call on his phone while he was on the line with the FBI. He returns the call, and someone on the other side answers, asking if he is a United States soldier. Paul responds, "I'm not an American soldier. I'm just an ordinary truck driver working for a company in Iraq." However, the man doubts his response and states, "If you're American, then you're also a soldier." The man then informs Paul that if he wants to get out of this situation, he needs to deliver $5 million by 9 p.m. Otherwise, the man will bury him alive. It is revealed that the same individual is responsible for all this chaos. In response, a nervous Paul tells him that he doesn't have that much money, as he's just a regular truck driver. If he had that kind of money, he wouldn't be working in Iraq. However, the man suggests that Paul contact the American embassy and discuss the matter with them. He is certain that they will pay $5 million to rescue an American citizen. After saying this, the man hangs up the call. Paul is certain that the American embassy would never provide such a large sum of money for a truck driver. Nevertheless, he decides to call the state government after obtaining the number from his sister-in-law. As Paul provides all the details about his situation, the woman on the other end of the line informs him that she is already aware of his situation. It turns out that when he sent the voice message earlier, she received it instantly. Paul then explains that the kidnapper demanded a ransom of $5 million, and that if the money is not received, he will be left to die. Unfortunately, the woman informs him that they cannot provide $5 million because it goes against their policy of not negotiating with terrorists. This frustrates Paul, and he tells her that it's easy to make a decision while sitting in an office, but he's the one who's about to die in a few hours. He asks what will happen to his family after his death. Upon hearing this, the woman finally feels some sympathy for Paul and provides him with the number of a man named Dan, who is the commander of the hostage group in Iraq. She assures him that Dan will certainly help in this situation. Full of hope, Paul quickly calls Dan, who reveals that he is already aware of his problem. He advises Paul to stay calm and assures him that he will be safe before 9 p.m. Dan also instructs Paul to put the phone on silent mode to save battery and to breathe more slowly to conserve oxygen inside the coffin. Shortly after ending the call, the kidnapper calls Paul again. He informs him that the US government refused to pay $5 million, claiming that Paul is just an ordinary truck driver. Surprisingly, the kidnapper believes his story and agrees to reduce the ransom to $1 million. Furthermore, he orders Paul to record a video asking the US government for the ransom. The kidnapper explains that there is a bag inside the coffin containing a small script. Paul must read it to record the video. Up until that moment, our protagonist had no idea that there were other items inside the coffin. However, upon looking at his feet, he finds the bag and becomes excited. When he opens it, he discovers a flashlight, a script, a knife, and a bottle of alcohol. Paul decides to call his wife, but once again, he cannot reach her. At this moment, he realizes that the battery is running low. Not knowing what to do, he calls Dan and informs him that the kidnapper ordered him to record a video. Dan doesn't give his approval, but assures Paul that they are doing their best and that the rescue will happen soon. To reassure Paul, he shares the story of the rescue of a 23-year-old student that took place 2 weeks ago. However, Paul is still very nervous and calls his mother. She answers immediately, but doesn't recognize him due to a mental condition she has. Even so, Paul tells her that this may be the last time they speak and expresses his love for her. Shortly after, Paul receives a video message on his phone. In it, his friend Pamela explains that despite being an American citizen, the US government didn't help her or meet the kidnapper's demands. At the end of the video, there is a shocking moment when someone shoots Pamela in the head, leaving Paul horrified. He panics and ends up vomiting inside the coffin, beginning to believe that his death is inevitable. Shortly after, Paul receives a call from Dan, informing him that he should not have recorded the video, as it was a ploy by the kidnappers to pressure the US government. Currently, the video has already garnered 47,000 views on YouTube. While the two continue talking, Paul hears the sound of prayers coming from a distant mosque. He shares this information with Dan, who reassures him, saying they are very close to rescuing him. Suddenly, there's a loud explosion, causing a crack at the top of the coffin. This allows a large amount of sand to start pouring in. Terrified, Paul struggles to use his clothes to block the cracks. At that moment, he receives a call from Dan, who reveals that his team carried out the attack and that the kidnapper likely died in the explosion. However, the sand continues to seep into the coffin, further diminishing Paul's hope. Faced with this situation, he decides to record one last video for his wife and child, expressing his deep emotions. Then the kidnapper, who survived the attack, calls again. He reminds Paul that time is running out and that if he wants to stay alive, he needs to deliver $1 million quickly. However, Paul refuses, stating that the government will not provide any money. In response, the kidnapper instructs him to cut off his own finger and create a video to increase the pressure on the government. When Paul refuses, the kidnapper threatens to kill his wife and child, even revealing their home address. This threat terrifies Paul, and fearing for his family's safety, he decides to cut off his finger and make the video, giving in to the kidnapper's demands. Suddenly, he sees a beam of light coming from above, indicating that rescue is near. However, he soon realizes it's just an illusion. Paul remains trapped inside the coffin with nowhere to go. Then he receives a call from Dan, informing him that they have found him and will rescue him soon. Meanwhile, Paul finally receives a call from his wife. Amid sobs, she asks about his condition. He reassures her, saying he's fine and about to be rescued, promising that he'll be back home soon. As all this unfolds, the sand continues to pour into the coffin, threatening to bury Paul alive before he can be saved. Worried, he calls Dan and pleads to be saved as quickly as possible. Dan tries to calm him down, assuring him that they are almost there. However, when they open the coffin, they discover that another man is inside. Upon hearing this, all of Paul's hopes vanish, and he finally accepts his fate. Dan, still on the call, sincerely apologizes for not being able to rescue him. The film ends as the sand completely fills the coffin and the lights go out. The film ends, leaving the audience with a feeling of anguish and reflection on the fragility of life and the cost of human greed. Paul's story serves as a grim reminder of how thoughtless actions can have irreversible consequences. Hey, comment below what you thought of the movie, and don't forget to leave a like to help the channel grow. See you in the next summary.